Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Jimmy Fleming. I am the Composition and Writing Specialist and the Director of Business Development for PowerNotes, one of this year's sponsors. You can see my contact information here. I'll repeat it a couple of times because there's ways in which I hope you will reach out, and there's reasons why I hope you reach out to me. But in a few moments, I'll have the pleasure to formally introduce our workshop leader, Dr. Janae Cohn, who's been chatting with us all momentarily from California State University at Sacramento. We are a proud sponsor of IWAC 2020, and I want to thank Mike Palmquist and his conference planning committee for accepting us as a sponsor and for giving us the opportunity today to help launch the use of the Whova platform by hosting this workshop. We are thrilled that we could support IWAC 2020 in a couple of other ways too. For instance, we're happy to support GTA participation in the conference by offering a grant to cover the registration for 10 graduate presenters, and that's always exciting. So our thanks go out to the WAC graduate organization as well for help facilitating that. And we are also offering free access to PowerNotes for 1 year for anyone who registered with the conference. You should have received an email earlier this year about that. But I want to go out for just a moment and tell you how you can redeem your PowerNotes account information. You got an email with instructions, but there's another way that you can go about and find out what we're all about. I'm now on the Whova homepage, and if you'll notice on the homepage, there is a link for sponsors over here in the left column. But also, if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see a sponsor page too. If you link directly from this link that I'm hovering over now, you will reach this. And on this page, there's a couple of things I want to point out. You can redeem your code, and the code is IWAC 2021. That will give you 1 year of free access to PowerNotes. You can redeem the code by clicking this button, and this button will then take you down further on the screen to this set of instructions about how to set up an account and to start using PowerNotes. I'll tell you a little bit about PowerNotes in a moment, but not a lot. There's also something else we want you to take advantage of. We are offering a raffle, and raffle prizes are these. If you see here, there's one raffle that will, the winner will take home an Amazon gift card or a donation of $100 to the charity of your choice. The second prize will be one free 1 year premium access accounts for 5 of your colleagues who perhaps are not in attendance at this conference. And the bigger prize is a free access to PowerNotes account for an entire class or your writing program or a department or in your entire school. And that would be open to all students, faculty, and staff through the fall 2021. And to do that, you need to click this button and just answer a few questions. Let me go back out here for a moment. I want to tell you just a little bit about PowerNotes, and then we're going to move into, I promise this will not be a demo, and then we're going to move into Dr. Cohn's workshop. Briefly, PowerNotes is a digital platform that helps researchers gather, organize, track the work that they do reading online. It's designed to address 3 problems encountered by digital students and researchers of all stripes: screen reading and comprehension, managing the flood of resources and information, and protecting the integrity of sources while avoiding patch writing and plagiarism. For teachers, PowerNotes helps make reading visible. There are ways in which we do that. We create opportunities for tutoring, peer review, and collaboration online by using our sharing and commenting tools, for example. And that makes it possible for tutors, teachers, or peers to see students' work early, which means that they can identify struggling students and they can support reading, research, and writing at all stages. We also have tools that help create opportunities for students to see their work online reflectively. We have new time on task tools that will help students understand better their own work habits, including the reading that they do online, annotating that they do with the source material, and the manners in which they talk back to their text. And soon we will be launching a new feature that will automatically collect all citation information, and then another also that guides students to lateral reading and to assessing the value of their sources. So all in all, we hope that PowerNotes will help students make reading visible. Now I can, and will be free after Janae leads us to the workshop, to highlight any of those moments or claims that I make at the close of our session, or I can ask you to get in touch with me, and I'll put some contact information in the chat room if you didn't grab it on the screen momentarily, a few moments ago. But now, please, here's my information. Without any further ado, I have the great pleasure to turn things over to our workshop moderator, Dr. Janae Cohn. A few words. Dr. Cohn is the director of academic technology at California State University, Sacramento, and she's the author of this new book, Skim, Dive, Surface, Teaching Digital Reading, published by West Virginia University Press. Janae writes and speaks about digital pedagogy and online teaching and learning. She's a trained writing instructor, has taught online, hybrid, and face-to-face composition courses, and she supports faculty in the development of courses across modalities. She regularly offers workshops on topics related to online instruction, humanities pedagogy, and digital literacy. Her research interests include digital information literacy, metacognitive thinking, and reading and writing across the curriculum. Prior to joining Sacramento State, Dr. Cohn was an academic technology specialist at Stanford University for 4 years. She received her doctorate in writing, rhetoric, and composition from the University of California, Davis, and a BA in English with an emphasis on creative writing from the University of California, Los Angeles. And my last plug for PowerNotes, we are going to be offering up a couple copies of Dr. Cohn's new book. And to enter that ad hoc raffle, you just need to drop me a quick email at jimmy@powernotes.com with your name, affiliation, and contact information. I'm going to collect all the entries and notify the winners at the end of next week. But for now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Janae Cohn.
Thank you so much for the intro, Jimmy, and thanks for an exciting overview of PowerNotes. We'll definitely have a good chunk of time at the end here to explore some open-ended questions, some conversations about PowerNotes specifically. I do want to say up front, before we dive in, that I will need to depart at exactly the hour here. The session does go until 15 minutes after the hour. So I'm hoping I'm going to try to keep things snappy and interactive. We've got a small enough group today. I think we can do that. So I'm going to sort of be flipping the Q&A a little bit, taking some questions about the substance of this workshop as we go. So you might think of that 15 minutes at the end here is really that time to dig into PowerNotes, and Jimmy will be capping us off to do that. So just want to give you some sense of kind of the expectation with the timing today. I put in the chat a link to the slide deck I'll be using. It's the same as what's in the program, but if you prefer the live version in browser as opposed to the PDF version I uploaded to the program, just want to give people a few different access points for engaging with the content today. And I see many of you are there. Thank you, anonymous animals, axolotls, and manatees, and unicorns. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share screen here, make this a bit bigger. So thank you all for taking the time to kick off IWAC 2021 with me and Jimmy today. We're going to be thinking about how to encourage deep reading online. And we're going to be starting by thinking about some really broad principles for discussing what it means to read in digital spaces for students, what that looks like, what deep reading across the curriculum really is. And then we'll end again by kind of looping into some ways that particular tools, and in this case, PowerNotes, might support some of these deep reading, some of these ways of engaging with deep reading online. So really our big question we'll try to answer today is how do we support student engagement, focus, and deep reading practices on screen? I know that many of you have probably been asking this question, particularly during 17 months-ish of some form of emergency remote instruction. So I imagine that many of you have already seen and encountered some ways to answer this question. So throughout the time together, I'm going to be asking, again, we're going to be flipping some of the conversation here, so it won't just me be talking and then Q&A at the end. We're going to take several deliberate pauses where I'll give you some prompts in the chat to respond to, so we can have a little bit more of a dialogue as we go. So if you're here and you don't use the chat, that's fine. We can find some other ways for you to engage. But if you're interested, the chat's going to be a good way for us to kind of check in with each other. So here's our rough plan for today, how we're going to move. We're going to define what deep reading is. We're going to think about how reading online changes our reading practices. What are some of the unique qualities of reading online that give our students some affordances or benefits that actually might bring out some different qualities in the deep reading experience. I imagine many of you might have encountered some limitations or might be concerned with limitations, and we'll address those as well. And then we'll end by thinking about some strategies, some ways of engaging readers, so we can think about what we can do to support and really leverage those benefits of reading online while still recognizing the limitations and finding ways to respond to them. First, I just want to point you to some resources. So if you're in the live slide deck, if you click this link, and I'll put it in the chat too, just so you have multiple access points here, you'll see I just kind of have like this is what I call my goodie bag. This is your goodie bag of some continued reading, some resources, some links to things that are related to this talk. I like to share it up front because I actually encourage in these things some active multitasking and exploration, right? So if you're hearing something as you're listening that makes you think, oh, I really want to learn more about that piece of research we just discussed, or that idea, you've got this goodie bag to kind of be exploring as we're thinking through. So I want the time to be actively useful and applicable to the use cases you're imagining. And again, don't be scared to chat. We're going to be using this throughout the workshop. So I'm pretty adept at checking the chat and reading out loud what's coming there throughout. So don't worry, you're not going to distract me if you want to chime in with a question or an idea as we go. If you're a tweeter, do feel free to live tweet. I don't think this particular conference has a hashtag, so I just use the hashtag for my book that Jimmy mentioned at the beginning. So if you do want to engage in that space too, feel free. I'll get to Twitter messages and things from that hashtag after the workshop's over. If that's a space where you want to connect outside of it, just want to give you options. All right, so as we think about how we define deep reading or how we define deep reading online, I'd like to hear a little bit about your experiences, our experience as a group first. So in the chat, if you wouldn't mind for just a minute or two here, I'd like for you to share, what are your experiences like with reading online? If you had to characterize it, when you read, regardless of discipline, maybe something you're reading as a composition scholar or something that you're reading even for fun, what are your experiences like? Just broadly. And Mary's saying it's easy to get distracted. Maureen's not a fan. She's more of a skimmer than a deep reader. We're going to unpack that a little bit. But yeah, I think that's a common experience to be a kind of a skimmer online because of the ways that online interfaces are designed to kind of privilege looking for certain pieces of information. Eye scanning software from people who do user experience research tends to affirm that. So Deidre's saying she reads faster, but not as thoroughly. I appreciate Jua's comment here that, Jua uses the Control F function, right? So kind of pecking through in some very deliberate ways. That's actually a really great strategy, right? Carrie's saying annotation tools need to be more robust. That might be something we think about when we return to the Power Notes section at the end. Chris is saying too many tabs and windows, right? So we might be moving laterally. That's a term I'm stealing. Using from, why am I blanking on the name of the scholar? It's going to come back to me. Mike Caulfield, who refers to practices where you open tabs to do research and explore. Rick is saying it depends on the purpose and format. It's sometimes pleasurable, sometimes deep, often not. Right, Rick, you're thinking ahead to where we're going to go next, really, is that we're going to really be focusing on those different purposes and how those might change our behaviors online or not. Joyce is suggesting she's less likely to mark up the text for future reference. So we'll think through why that is too, what some barriers might be. And Lynn is suggesting, I don't retain as much sometimes. And that might also be dictated by that purpose and even that format piece that Rick is speaking to. And Ruben's saying, don't enjoy it as much. I want to think back to that as well, right? Because I think there is an affective, a feelings-based component to reading that we often forget or neglect, right? That I think for especially this group, who I think can safely say this is a group of professional readers, we've associated reading with really, again, immensely pleasurable kinds of experiences. And the quality of the printed book, there's research that shows that the connections that we form emotionally with material objects like books can impact our willingness to or interest in engaging with other kinds of media and materiality. So thank you. We have a pause here in the chat, so we're going to move along, but I appreciate the engagement with this because, again, there's several pieces we're going to point to, so I'll use your comments as reference points for some of what we're discussing in a moment. So many of you spoke to how reading on screen means you're not reading as deeply, you're not reading as much, you're not annotating. Laura spoke to still needing pen and paper to do that note-taking work. So I think it's worth unpacking really what are we talking about when we're talking about deep reading, and what about reading on screen may create some barriers or limitations to engaging in what we might consider deep reading practice. So I'm going to use Marianne Wolf's definition of deep reading here. And Marianne Wolf is a cognitive psychologist who has studied the reading brain, and she studies also certain kinds of reading disabilities like dyslexia. She defines deep reading processes as processes that underlie our abilities to find, reflect, and potentially expand upon what matters when we read. And I've put this first sentence of the quote in a bolded font face here to emphasize that this gets at to Rick's point here about purpose, right? That when we think about deep reading, we're developing a really deep understanding of what is most important from that reading. It's not just sort of information for information's sake, it's thinking about the application of that reading to other ideas, right? They represent the full sum of the cognitive, perceptual, and affective processes, right? That speaks to Ruben's point about enjoyment, that prepare readers to apprehend, grasp, and assimilate the essence of what is read beyond decoded information, beyond a basic comprehension, and sometimes beyond what the author writes or even intends. Now, I think it's worth breaking down this definition a little bit further, right? So when Wolf writes that deep reading is going beyond decoded information, we might think of this as reading for content uptake, for perspective taking, for background knowledge, right? So one kind of deep reading process that we might consider is one where we're trying to really understand the history of a particular document, right? Where we're trying to understand context, background. She writes that it goes beyond basic comprehension. So this might mean reading for research and reading rhetorically, right? So this might mean trying to think about, okay, not just what's literally on the page, not just basic literacy uptake, but how do these ideas connect to questions that we're trying to answer? Or how are these ideas reflective of particular rhetorical situations that we're trying to interrogate as readers or that our students are trying to interrogate? And finally, it's beyond what the author writes or even intends, which we might consider reading for analysis, identifying themes or patterns or conclusions. So some of that reading beyond what the author writes or even intends may involve some rhetorical reading here as well. But we might think of this kind of category of deep reading as really referring to that process of thinking about how certain themes or theoretical lenses shape the ways that we're engaging with text or the kind of information we're encountering. So I think it's always important to start with unpacking this definition here, to examine our own practices as readers. That is, when we're reading on screen, in what context are we attempting to go beyond decoded information, basic comprehension, or beyond what the author writes or even intends, right? And if we start to think about those different situations, then we can also start to think about how our behavior around those situations might change. The same goes for our students, of course. To what extent are their reading tasks framed by these calls for engaging in these particular deep reading processes? That is, how much are we explicitly asking them to read in different ways? When we talk about reading and writing across the curriculum, we're often thinking in terms of genre, and we're often thinking in terms of discourse community. And the same goes for deep reading. That is, as we invoke deep reading practices, we'll want to think about making these kinds of ways of reading transparent. And I do owe the term ways of reading to Petrosky and Bartholomew's pretty famous anthology ways of reading. And while I'm not using their exact terms, a lot of this kind of mapping, what I've done with Marianne Wolf's definition, overlaps with their work in this space. So again, in the chat, you expressed some challenges to perhaps unpacking and engaging in these ways of deep reading. So I want to now address how reading online does in fact change our practices. So we know that there are a range of ways that we can read and engage with text, right? And these ways continue to diversify as our students and as we encounter and use new devices, or in some cases, devices that have been around a while but might be new to us. So of course, I'm going to situate ourselves a little bit here in our current moment, that prior to the pandemic, we could, I think, count on students having diverse access to printed books through the library, through the bookstore, through course reserves. Maybe we had some of our students using dedicated e-readers like the device that's pictured here on the upper right corner. And I think we can equally count on students trying to access text from various digital access points, like their laptop computers, their mobile phones, or through audio on their mobile phones as well. When we think of reading, we tend to think primarily of a visual process because definitions of literacy tend to be bound to a kind of visual practice. However, it is a valid reading practice to listen to an audiobook, and for many students, especially for those who are blind or who are visually impaired in some capacity, reading is auditory. And again, that is a perfectly, that is an inclusive way to understand reading for people with all kinds of bodies. And the pandemic in particular, right, we probably couldn't count on student access to print books or readers in as dedicated a capacity, right? So how did our students' experiences of reading on screen get changed? How do we activate those ways of deep reading, knowing that their access to certain devices may be more restrictive than perhaps prior to the pandemic? So we'll get to that in a moment, but I want to acknowledge a reality first, which is that a concern with students' limited access. Oh, and this slide got mixed up. No wonder I was a little off in my ordering there. I'm sorry. I skipped a slide. Thank you. I had a transition queued up that got a little off. So let's kind of pick up where we left off, which is just to say with some data about student device access. And this data actually does come from data from prior to the pandemic, which is that even before the pandemic, even before this moment when we knew that students' device access was limited to certain kinds of digital devices in particular, according to data from the EDUCAUSE Research Center, which does major survey studies of thousands of students across 2-year and 4-year colleges. 7% of community college students in particular own laptops, and 99% of community college students own smartphones. While this particular data set comes from a 2-year college context in particular, their 4-year data is mapped very similarly. I used the 2-year device data here because it was the most recent. Their 4-year device data is from 2018. But I would suspect these numbers are in a largely upward trajectory and probably accelerated by the pandemic, which suggests that even with these limited options now, we want to be thinking about how students' basic material access might be impacting their abilities to engage in those deep reading processes that we just unpacked and spoke to. Here we go. So how does the research bear out on this? And how does reading online really change and impact these practices, even within the context of these material realities? So many scholars do worry that reading on screen leads to diminished outcomes for those deep reading practices, especially around comprehension. And the fact is those worries are not unfounded. According to a meta-study from 2018 of 54 studies from 10 years, so from 2008 to 2018, a group of researchers did a big meta-analysis of studies comparing paper-based and screen-based reading behavior. And they did find that paper-based reading groups tended to demonstrate greater reading comprehension than digital-based reading groups across different sample sizes and studies. I should also mention this is also across different age groups. So younger readers did not perform better on reading comprehension tasks than older readers did from this 10-year data set, contrary to the often popular belief that students are, quote, digital natives. This is a term I'd like to eliminate from everyone's vocabulary, not only because of the problematic colonialist implications of being a native, but also because device access and exposure has to do with certain kinds of educational privileges. Even though we know that students are largely owning devices, that doesn't mean they've had exposure to practices and engagements with understanding and being aware of what deep reading practices are, nor have they necessarily been taught or framed ways to approach reading on screen that might allow them to activate those ways of reading we unpacked just a few moments ago. So should we despair? Should we worry? I don't think so, not yet, because I think that part of the reason we're seeing decades worth of disparities around major comprehension gaps are because of the strategies we've taught and used. And many of you have spoken to this in the chat already, right? That many of us are used to highlighting dog-earing pages, maybe using index cards or notes to capture particular points about a reading. These are all strategies that are deeply dependent upon paper-based modalities. These are all great strategies. I don't even think we should jettison them. They're extremely valuable, and I appreciate how much they can, this activates what Christina Haas, a rhetorician, refers to as text sense, that ability to use the materiality of paper to situate particular ideas in a place and time. And that's a strategy that those 54 studies demonstrated as being valuable as well. That's a big reason why those comprehension gains are so high for paper-based modalities. But I'm wondering how we build upon these approaches. And I'm wondering when we should try something completely different. That is, many of you in the chat, I'm thinking especially of the comment about using Control F, Ju's comment about having the Control F, having tabs and windows open, and using certain kinds of annotation tools. I'm wondering whether some of those capacities, some of those behaviors might allow us to try strategies that are different. Perhaps there's some benefit to having multiple tabs open for a research-based writing situation. Perhaps there's some benefit to using Control F for looking for particular key terms and ideas that might be recurring when attempting to read rhetorically, for example. So with that, I'm wondering if we can think a little bit about, given this information, given some of the concerns, but given some of the potential for affordance, what kinds of reading activities might be well suited for an online environment, knowing the material reality that many of our students are going to be engaging on screen, may have to engage on screen. What do we think? Are there certain kinds of activities that might benefit from the ability to skim? Are there certain kinds of deep reading behaviors that might benefit from the ability to look for particular key terms or concepts? So I'm seeing Victoria's mentioning annotations, and Nelson's mentioning that as well. We're going to return to some ways of reading that might benefit from social annotation. Victoria talks about summary as well. Anne is speaking to intertextual content in a text, looking up where things come from and exploring those rabbit holes. Yes, I love that particular example, Anne, because you really do have the benefit of being able to link and see quick connections around context, which can be really beneficial for rhetorical reading in particular. And Victoria's speaking to concept mapping too. Yes, we're going to look at a specific example of that in a moment as well. Anything else? Some other ideas for reading that might be well suited? Maybe thinking about, to go back to some of those deep reading definitions, are there ways in which deep reading might activate that, move it beyond decoded information, for example? So Chris is speaking to closeness to platforms where reading is connected. Yeah, so you could be doing some reading and writing very easily at the same time. That might allow you to sort of do a little bit of that reading for themes. You could be taking notes in a very mindful way as you go. You can do that on paper too, but there's something to be said for being able to create immediate visible linkage. Lynn is speaking to audio recording to speak back to the document. Yes, I love a more literal conversation with the author. So we have this ability to think really expansively about getting at the core of reading as conversation. That might do something different for students who may struggle with visual text in some way, and who may find that creative ideas kind of emerge for them with the ease of recording and sharing audio. And right, as Anne writes, to build on Lynn, having a conversation with others while you read. And then that speaks to the social annotation that Nelson and Victoria were mentioning above too. So I'm going to take a pause here, and we're going to talk about some specific activities, and many of them overlap with what you all mentioned, but I'm going to put that in the context of a particular framework. So, right, what can we do to support and engage readers online? So in my book, Skim Dive Surface, Teaching Digital Reading, I map out 5 ways of engagement that overlap with a lot of the activities that many of you are mentioning in the chat now. These 5 ways of engagement I've called curation, connection, creativity, contextualization, and contemplation. I'm going to break down what these 5 ways of engagement mean, give a brief example activity for each, and then we're going to pass it back to Jimmy, and we'll think about how some of this connects with PowerNotes in particular as one tool that might activate these ways of engagement. I'm going to take about 5 to 10 minutes here. It'll be closer to 10 by the time we get through all 5 of these. So I'm going to be speedy to kind of make time for having some discussion about these materials, and again, connection to PowerNotes. So just want to give you a bit of a heads up on how we're doing kind of timing wise. So curation is a behavior that refers to readers' abilities to collect resources, bring them together, and create new knowledge as a result. So social annotation can be a kind of curation-based activity because in an annotation situation, right, readers are kind of bringing together highlighted moments, right? They're curating the most maybe important or interesting or confusing, perhaps, parts of a text. And they're creating new knowledge by seeing and exploring those ideas together, by looking at them in a shared collaborative space. But curation could also refer to this sort of research process, right? Where you're having students find different articles across the web, bring those together into something. PowerNotes has an outline feature where you basically, it shows you as a reader what things you've highlighted across text you've read across the web and puts them into one place. It's a great example of a really fantastic curatorial practice. So students can really see how different quotes or ideas from the web might interconnect to help them respond to research questions or answer new questions. A challenge of reading online that actually I don't think anyone spoke to. Maybe at the very beginning, someone mentioned distraction, right? But a big problem of reading online is that it's really easy to get distracted by the sheer volume of texts. So we want to activate curatorial thinking in our students and in ourselves when we're reading online to avoid that feeling of being overwhelmed by information and to help us identify important pieces. We want to curate too when we're reading in print, but it's even more important to practice this online because of the sheer amount of information we might encounter. So I gave the example of how PowerNotes in particular might activate a certain kind of curatorial mindset, but you might also think about curation activities you can do with your students, like using a bookmarking tool like Pocket to help students create folders of articles they might be finding. You might encourage students to come up with, as they're finding articles, labels or tags to create different sets of subfolders of things that they're encountering as they're reading for research or moving across the web. Coming up with those topic-based tags or ways of categorizing information can be a way of activating curation. Even within the context of one particular reading, if you want a student to read deeply and closely in one reading and to curate the important ideas there, you could use a tool like Padlet, which is kind of like a digital pinboard, where they could take quotes from the reading that they're doing, put them up on the pinboard, and they could see a kind of collage of the moments that stand out. So again, we can dig into how PowerNotes in particular does this in some ways, but these are just a few different examples of certain activities you could do to activate that really deep reading focus on identifying those moments that might be activating either looking for key themes or trying to identify certain recurring or pertinent ideas in a reading. The second component of our framework is connection. And this refers to readers' abilities to bridge what they're reading with prior knowledge or experiences. So this is kind of what Anne was speaking to, and I think Victoria was speaking to a little bit as well, which is sort of seeing where things come from and kind of mapping out those connections. So we know that students can build upon prior knowledge to activate new ideas, to generate new knowledge. And it can be really powerful for students to see when they're encountering a reading for the first time, how that reading might, again, connect with something they've, heard or seen or read before. And they could do this in print quite easily when you annotate in the margins, right? Sometimes you might say, oh, this reminds me of this other thing that I saw or read. And online, something we can activate is making that connection really visible and do that for other people too. So an example of this might be an activity I like to just sort of shorthand highlight and link my very literal images of a highlighter and a chain link fence, where you could ask students to, in a social annotation platform or in a tool like PowerNotes, to highlight a component of a text online, and in a comment to that text, put in a literal link to what that moment is reminding them of. So if this reminds them of something they encountered in a prior class, if this reminds them of a video they saw on YouTube, if this reminds them of a meme they encountered on social media, they could just link that directly. And you create this really powerful, as Anne sort of said, intertextual kind of collage of ideas. And that really maximizes, A, the linkages you already are maybe finding online, but B, it deepens the connections to help students, again, identify those themes, to identify and to focus on how those themes might be operationalized across a series of texts. Our third component is creativity, which refers to readers' abilities to apply an idea from a reading and create something new as a result. And I'd say this maybe ties into Lynn's suggestion about using that audio recording. Or again, this could also be similar to Victoria's suggestion around concept mapping too, which is that sometimes when students read a challenge, I've encountered this, I suspect you have too, is students might ask, well, what do I do with this reading? Like, okay, so I'm just gonna sort of absorb the knowledge and it's there. But like, how do I, you tell me to read actively, but what does that really mean? And so creativity as a component of this framework encourages us to do something with the reading, right? So an audio recording is a new product of the reading. It exists outside of the text, even as it's working in response to it. That's very powerful for students to realize that their voice can be part of creating new knowledge from the reading experience. Again, you could do this on paper. It's not that you can't do this on paper, but when you're doing reading on screen anyway, again, a benefit is that you can interlink these things. So if you have students, for example, take up Lynn's idea to create this audio recording, they can create a voice memo on their phones or on an audio recording application on their computer and attach it directly to the document. They could have them submit it to your learning management system. There's a lot of different capacities to easily see in a much more visible way how your voice matters as something new emerging from that reading conversation. And that can make reading feel really alive in some very different ways. Print can feel very static and immovable. Digital text can be modified and customized, which demonstrate that is in fact, again, part of a conversation that you get to contribute to and shape. So we talked about that audio memo example. The other example I just wanted to share, which again, I think ties in with Victoria's note about concept mapping, is I've had students create sort of like a reading infographic or a reading flowchart, which is what this image on the screen is demonstrating. So you might have students try to map out, okay, in big bucket concepts, what's the argument of the text? What are the key ideas that emerge from there? What are some of the subpoints that are made? They could color code, right? It could help them to kind of take new perspective from the text that they're reading. Our fourth category engagement is contextualization, which refers to readers' abilities to understand both the text's literal meaning and why the text was composed in a particular way. So this is a kind of shorthand for rhetorical reading in some ways. But the point of contextualization as a reading strategy, an online reading strategy in particular, is that a challenge of reading online, and again, I don't think this is one that anyone mentioned in this group, but something I've heard in other groups is sometimes instructors are very worried that their students, especially when they're doing research, are going to struggle with information literacy. They're going to struggle to understand in what context a certain article appears or in what context a certain kind of argument is being made. And that can be a challenge when you're seeing a bunch of flat search results, or you're finding a lot of articles in decontextualized capacities on your social media feeds or on discussion boards or on Reddit. So the idea of designing activities that activate contextualization is that you're engaging deep reading behaviors that invite students not just to look at and examine the text literally, but to toggle mindfully between engagement with that text and engagement with materials outside of it. So let me give an example. You might, as an activity, invite students to follow a citation trail for an article they're reading for your class or an article they're researching. And so this kind of image here of this white bar on the left, that's a screenshot just from Google Scholar. You could design an exercise where in Google Scholar or in your library's research database, you ask students to see who else cited this piece. What are we learning about them? A lot of folks mentioned tabs, right? Chris mentioned all the tabs. And Chris also mentioned closeness to platforms where reading is connected. And this would be a great example to kind of leverage that closeness to different platforms to really show how reading is part of this larger conversation. Again, you could do this easily in print, but sometimes books or even printouts, they feel like isolated material artifacts, separate from a larger context in which conversations are happening. So by reading online, by showing students, look, you can see who exactly is speaking to whom in these citation trails, especially for scholarly reading, it really, again, powerfully demonstrates how reading is situated and what the value of reading is, especially as you're trying to activate deep reading around research-based thinking, or around rhetorical construction, or around identifying themes across time and history in conversations, you get to do a little bit more with this, and you get to see how all those contexts inform that text. And finally, and I'm going to wrap up in a couple minutes here, which will give us a good buffer, basically, for discussing any of these activities more, thinking about PowerNote's connection to these ideas. But finally, contemplation is our fifth strategy, which refers to readers' abilities to allocate attentional resources appropriately and to articulate a clear vision for why they are reading in the first place. So again, earlier on, we mentioned distraction being a concern, right? When you're reading on screen, your laptop, your phone, you're probably navigating a lot of pop-ups, your emails popping up. It's very tempting and easy to just click a tab over and start watching cat videos or whatever it is you do on the internet. So part of what we need to encourage students to think about, especially for reading on screen, but again, not exclusively, is to be mindful of how they're paying attention to text, regardless of the media. And we might think about ways we can leverage the capacity to, again, to build off of Chris' points, to be close to platforms for writing and for thinking, so that they have a clear sense all the way through of why they're reading. I would say the first step to this is to go back to the very beginning, to what Rick mentioned around understanding the purpose for reading. Students should always know right up front, regardless of media, why am I reading this? What's the point? Well, what am I supposed to be getting out of this? What way of reading am I activating? And then we could add a layer of materiality on top of that. Why am I reading it here? How do I benefit from reading it online? How is that going to shape and change the way I approach the writing task or the thinking task, whatever it is that I'm doing after I encounter the text? So one activity example might be to leverage an explicit kind of note-taking or citation management kind of process as part of the reading experience. So the icons you're seeing on screen, they're representing different kinds of note-taking tools. So Microsoft OneNote, if you are at a Microsoft campus, is one example of a tool you could really leverage. And OneNote is basically a digital notebook where you might have an activity where you invite students to pay attention to certain kinds of moments in the text and to toggle between the reading and the notebook itself as part of your practice. It's very, it can be very unified, I should say, to move from one window to another, perhaps, thinking about, okay, what do certain sentences, moments in the text activate, and how do I quickly note that or link to it in my notes? So a benefit to OneNote in comparison to a paper notebook is that you could copy and paste links in moments that you're reading. If there are anchor tags in the text, that is moments that are sort of tagged in place on a web page, you could keep track of those in your notebook. If there's certain moments or citations or links that are embedded in the text itself, a lot of digital texts are hyperlinked in different kinds of ways. They could keep track of those links and further reading and resources. Again, you could do this quite easily in a paper notebook, but there might be things that make it, again, even more streamlined for certain students. They can try it anyway. And I always advocate for giving students a choice, right? So if you're including a deliberate note-taking component into your class, you could just give students options. You have these digital tool options, and you have these other paper tool options, and you can decide what works best for you. I think exposure is a really big piece for closing that comprehension gap that we saw in the research and the meta-analysis. This second icon just represents Google Keep. It's another tool that kind of does this note-taking type of capacity. And Zotero is an example of a citation manager. So if research-based writing is a really important part of your class, you might build an activity where you're asking students to use Zotero very mindfully, right? Hey, you're reading for research. This is why we're doing it. This is how we're focusing our attentional resources today. Let's keep track of your notes, the metadata, the tags that you're using to categorize this reading to make sure you have a really clear understanding of what's happening in this text. There are a lot more examples we could speak to, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for conversation because, again, we've got a small enough group here and I saw enough ideas in the chat. I really want to hear what more of your thoughts are. I'll just wrap by saying with PowerNotes, I think you can activate all these ways of engagement in different kinds of ways. And if folks are curious about that, I know Jimmy has got a bunch of materials queued up to kind of demonstrate some of these ways of engaging with PowerNotes through this particular framework. So I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and escape full screen here. I will just say, if you're in the deck, I'm pretty transparent in my deck. There are a few next step resources you can explore. I have an infographic with some of these categories of engagement activities. I got a link to my book because, you know, I gotta shill the book here a little bit. It's part of the thing. And there's some bonus slides too for some other concepts to think through if we're interested. But certainly, I want to take a little bit of time here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen to hear your questions about some of these digital reading strategies. I'd like to, you know, again, give Jimmy some space to share some of these connections to PowerNotes if we'd like. And thank you, Anne. And Nelson, I'm glad you're reading the book. Yay. So happy to take any questions at this point. Unless Jimmy, you'd like to share a little bit first about PowerNotes before we kind of open the floor to more questions here.
Janae, frankly, I'd want to avail the group of your time. So let's pick your brain first.
All right, super. Yeah, I've got about 10 minutes here before I'll have to boogie, as it were. And then there'll be 15 minutes after I leave. So I know that Anne expressed some interest in seeing this demo and PowerNotes, Jimmy. So maybe we can kind of, we can do a few open questions here and then maybe we can dive into that demo. That sound okay? Beautiful. And I see a hand up from Anne. So maybe, Anne, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I like Jimmy's idea that we could ask you a couple quick questions before you have to go. So I'm wondering, when we think of students taking multiple classes at once or maybe working on multiple projects at once, do you envision their digital reading practices as being all in one network, all in one place? Or do you envision them having different pockets? I wonder if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Anne. I appreciate you asking that. I think for the most part, the behaviors are probably going to be happening in different kinds of pockets, but I think it depends on the purpose for reading and what they're going to be doing with that reading. So I would say that in some academic contexts, the reading infrastructures might be narrower. For example, if students are encountering PDFs in their learning management system, and that's the only way the reading experience is being invited in, that's a much narrower kind of situation. And I think as an instructor, if you're really wanting students to engage deeply with PDFs in your learning management system, you might pick different tools or different kinds of activities to do that than, say, if you're asking students to do independent research, you know, go outside of what's in a learning management system. Right, you might be thinking about, okay, what tools and behaviors and activities might activate, say, deeper reading across my library platforms, or what might be activated in, say, a social annotation tool, or what might we want to be thinking about in terms of how students are encountering or engaging readings from things they might be finding on their phone, for example. So yeah, and I'm seeing Chris's point here about trying to promote integrative learning transfer. I think that's huge, right? So our assignments, if they're activating that integrative learning or we're assigning reading activities for transfer, we may want to draw attention to, okay, these are the platforms for reading you might use in these other contexts that you may be encountering outside of your class. And here's how you might behave or engage in productive ways in this kind of context that might impact what you do here. So like research is a perfect example of this, right? It's an academic practice that we may want to transfer to, you know, if you're teaching research in first year composition and you know they're going to encounter research in an upper division disciplinary course, you might be thinking about, again, how you leverage those research-based reading tools to think about those other contexts. So kind of speaking at a high level here, but I'm happy to kind of get more specific. Does that kind of help answer your question, Anne, or did I answer it? Okay, thumbs up. Excellent. What else is coming up for folks? Or are there kind of, did I respond? I mean, one question I always have in these talks is, you know, I'm always curious to hear some of the concerns up front. And I'm always curious when I ask that question about experiences of reading. Inevitably, most of them are kind of negative for reading online. So I am wondering whether, and if all, we want to address kind of some more of those concerns that we have, and if there are ways that these strategies might help us kind of respond to some of those concerns. If there's concerns you have that we didn't address, I'm always eager to kind of hear about those and think about how we get reactive or proactively responding to those concerns. And it's okay if not, it's just another provocation for us to think about. So Lynn's asking, should I create reading assignments that allow students to choose their medium of reading? If so, how would I manage that as an instructor? I love that question, Lynn. Thank you for asking that. So my first impulse is to answer that first question with yes. I think it would be great to create a reading assignment where students have some choice. This also activates what we might consider universal design for learning, if you're familiar with that concept. Universal design for learning refers to a sort of educational practice where students have one or more options to engage with reading or engage with any learning activity, I should say. I can put some resources in about UDL in the chat if you're interested. But how would you manage that is I think one way is to start small. So as a reader or as the instructor, you might just think of adding in or making explicit one additional way for students to read. So say, okay, you could encounter this text by either printing it out or reading it on your phone. And you could just add in one tool for doing that, depending on where they're finding the reading. So it could be as simple as, hey, there's your PDF up in your learning management system. Here's a PDF reader. You could download it, or here's PowerNotes. It works for PDFs too. Here is one tool that you can use to do this. And here are some instructions, here's some guidance. And if you, as the instructor, like, gosh, I don't know how to technically help students navigate these tools, that's okay, because there's someone out there who does. So if it's not you, you can talk to one of your librarians to help you with some of the instructions on how to use some of these digital reading tools. Librarians are great for this. Your instructional technologists on your campus or instructional designers are also really good people to ask on your campus for help with this. Or colleagues who you know have done these kinds of activities or assignments before are also really great. So even just kind of opening it up for one extra option and making explicit what that option is, I think can make a big difference. I'm seeing two other questions here and I've got about 5 minutes left. So I think I'm going to move to those last couple of questions. Lynn, if you want more there, we can kind of loop back, or you can chat with me offline. I'd be glad to talk to you there. I'm seeing a message from, well, let's get to, well, we'll talk about, I'm going to read Maureen's and Victoria's questions. I think they might kind of intertwine. So Maureen's asking, I have a lot of students reading on their smartphones, which does not encourage some of the strategies you talked about. Are there specific approaches to supporting students who are reading smaller devices? And Victoria's asking, is there any research demonstrating higher efficiency of any digital reading strategies compared to paper-based ones? So I'll start with Victoria's, and it might kind of feed into Maureen's. So Victoria, I have not encountered any research demonstrating higher efficiency. What I have seen is research about higher reading speeds on screen if students can customize their text. So there's a really great nonprofit out there called Readability Matters that's been doing a ton of really interesting research. I'm going to put it in the chat now about how text customization actually does impact some reading kind of, I guess it is efficiency, speed, which of course we know speed and efficiency does not equal deep reading or comprehension. But I think it's a provocative idea, right, to kind of imagine what would happen if we expose students to the fact that they could maybe customize font face, spacing, sizing. These are kind of accessibility measures that might make reading easier for some students, which could reduce that kind of cognitive barrier and that material barrier to access. So I think like there's something there. So that's the closest thing I think I've seen, Victoria. Maureen, to your question about smaller devices and what might support that, I think some of that depends a little bit on tool. So you're right that the note-taking activities in particular, those are going to be really hard to do on a mobile device. I think some things that could really work well on mobile is that voice memo idea actually that Lynn had earlier, right? Because doing a voice memo on a phone is in some ways actually a little easier than on the computer. And a lot of students are already, they know about this workflows. Some don't, so you'd still want to expose. And again, you could talk to, actually probably your instructional technologists are probably best for the apps for mobile work, or actually your disability or accessibility office is a really great office to talk to on your campus if you want instructions on how to use things like text-to-speech or audio that leverage mobile in particular, because they do it as an accommodation for students with disabilities all the time. And as it turns out, things that are often designed for students with disabilities are often really great for everyone. So that might be another place to kind of get some advice on leveraging mobile in particular. Another thought might be that some of these social annotation tools or PDF tools actually work really well on mobile. Jimmy, remind me, does PowerNotes have a mobile app yet? I think that's in development, right?
It's in development. It should be this fall.
Okay. Yeah, so soon. You know, some of those devices, you can use your finger to highlight and annotate on mobile. You can leave little sticky notes. So there's kind of some pieces there that I think could work really well. So again, so long as you kind of make them available and expose them as options. Thanks, Maureen. I appreciate you. And Victoria, thanks for your comment too. We've got a minute left before I got to bounce. And I really do want to make sure you actually see PowerNotes before you go. So I apologize, I'm going to miss part of the demo. But this is, I think, an exciting tool, and there's some really good potential to activate what we're doing here. So thanks, everyone. All right.
Janae, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And don't hesitate to get back in touch. My info is in that slide deck. You can email me. I'll put that in the chat. You can find me on the internet. I'm pretty easy to find, actually. So there you go. A lot of ways to reach me. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your conference. And maybe I'll see you around other Zoom rooms. I'm hoping to come to some other parts of IWAC here, too. So, all right. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Well, everyone, this is Jimmy Fleming. It's very hard act to follow Janae. She is so talented, skilled, exciting, and I love the comments about her research. She was gracious to us to make several comments that connected some of her work to PowerNotes, and I don't want to overstate any of that. But I'm happy to have a few moments to share a little bit about PowerNotes. I will also say that as much as anything else, I want to reinforce the options that you already have to take a look at PowerNotes on your own. And I plugged a couple of things in the chat room if you noticed it. There is the link that goes out to our page. It's also directed off the Whova platform, where you can go straight to PowerNotes and redeem the code. The code itself is for a year's free access to PowerNotes. And I also put in PowerNotes in our chat room my contact information, as well as a Calendly link. If you're interested in PowerNotes, a real demo of PowerNotes, or one that goes pretty well granularly soup to nuts, takes a little more time than I have here. So I'm just going to hit the hot spots. If you're interested in a fuller a deep dive, then just please contact me. I'd look forward to that conversation. I will just hit a couple of quick highlights and then let you guys go on to the rest of your days here. But more or less, the first thing I wanted to point out about PowerNotes is that it exists in two parts. And when you are using PowerNotes and download the browser extension or redeem the code, the first thing you have to do is download a browser extension. The instructions are pretty clear in the web link that I sent, as well as on our website. And by browser extension, we support Chrome and Mozilla and Edge currently, but you'll need a little bit more time before we're supporting Safari. I use Chrome most actively. That's just because it was the first out, and it's something that I've become used to. When you activate the browser extension, you'll see it up here in your tray. And I'll point out the other real simple thing, that with PowerNotes, to get it out of your way, if you're doing research and reading, you don't want PowerNotes to be in the way. All you need to do is just deactivate it, and it goes away. So then you can do all your reading, shopping, whatever you're doing online. But if you're using PowerNotes to do reading for any kind of research assignment, you simply will turn on the PowerNotes account. Premium access, which is what your code will help you get, means a couple of real simple things. Number one, it means that you have access to multiple projects inside PowerNotes. PowerNotes, incidentally, is free to everybody. You do not need to have any premium code or pay for it if you want to use PowerNotes for just one project. We talk about PowerNotes in terms of projects, and a project can mean anything. It could mean the research paper that a student is doing in Comp 101. It could be a dissertation. And the project is expansive. There is another limitation. We have an automatic OCR feature in PowerNotes for students who encounter PDFs that do not have a text layer on top of it. With a premium account, the limitation, and we will automatically recognize that the text does not have a text layer on it. And you can submit it to us. We will OCR it, send it back to you, and then you can go forth and use PowerNotes in its full iteration. The free account only affords 20 pages of OCR. The premium account is unlimited. Those are the two key distinctions about premium versus free. I'll quickly just show you some of the things that Janae was I've seen her present before, and I love the concept of the C's that she points out, the 5 C's, the curation, connection, creativity, contextualization, and contemplation. And yes, PowerNotes will address all of those in some way or another. The most obvious thing that I can point out to you is the curation aspect of PowerNotes. With the browser extension activated, all a student needs to do is go on a web page and highlight something that she's interested in looking for. And then the first thing that pops up will be this menu. If you take a look over on the right side, on the right side, the sidebar, every PowerNotes project opens with these 2 generic topics. We do not know what students are going to be researching. These topics are editable, and as the student begins to curate and begin to collect and organize, she can add topics here, or she can change topic names. I'm going to just kind of blitz through this fairly quickly and rather than show you all of those stepped out moves. Nevertheless, just keep in mind that the sidebar over here is the place where her source reading will be curated. Now, in terms of curation, one of the things that I think fascinating is about PowerNotes versus some other tools, web tools, is we tend to focus on the granular level, the highlight. So every individual highlight that I make on a text will create a digital note card. Take a look at what happens when I highlight this. I'm going to drop it just in background information. First thing that pops up over here on the screen on the sidebar, you can see that everything that I've highlighted is captured in quotation mark. And this is not editable in this note card phase. This means that the student will always be aware of what's collected. That's the source material, and what's collected, that's her writing. Now, writing, this is where that will take place. The student has the opportunity on this note card to begin to take notes. She can do any number of things in this note section. This is an annotation tool. And the annotation tool is unlimited, so the space in here is wide open. Now, there might be a way in which instructors will guide the students to do work here. In other words, giving some guidance about annotation. They want them to summarize the source, and they want them to talk back to the source. It could be anything. It could be question making. It could be just note taking. It just could be note to self to read later, something like that. Once she is satisfied with that first note, the passive note taking, hit enter, and then you see over here it populates in the note card. The note card is going to separate out my comments from the text, and my comments are editable. I can always come back in here and change what I've written, add to it, etc. And there's always a link back to the note, back to the source. So on each note card, as I go through a text and highlight stuff, I'm going to be able to drop stuff into the right topic, right organizational pace, and take notes, and then just do my reading. And one thing that happens here is the level of distractions is reduced. In other words, students do not have to leave this source. Common practice among students, according to our research, is that students will actively highlight, and then they'll copy something, and they'll open up a Word document and go over to the outside document and drop in the source information, as the quote, but they won't always capture the source information. So one of the other things that's going on here is that we're able to keep the students tied to the source from the material that they've collected. That, and once again, to link back to that source. Now, if you'll notice just a couple of nuances here, because I put this into a new topic, the color on my screen has changed, and it corresponds to the outline in my sidebar. And I can edit this and change the topic and make something specific out of my organization begins to develop and emerge. Now, quite honestly, the first pass students doing research, when they begin to build their outline, often it is a very expansive and generic organization. And that's okay, that's by design, because they have an opportunity to come back in and reorganize all of this material and put it into a different order, or to expand or contract their outline. If I have a couple moments, I hope I can show you how that's done. Mostly, though, I want to show you here that the second thing that's happened here is we're going to begin to collect all the citation information for each one of these highlights. And you'll notice on this note card, I have this sort of not filled in quotation mark. That's what it is. It's an icon that represents a quotation mark. If I click that, you'll see open on the sidebar over here that opens up these fields where we have collected all of the metadata that's important for the citation information generated by this source. It is the student's responsibility, and we put this disclaimer in here, that she is to come back in here and check and make sure all the source information is correct. In this case, for reasons that I cannot explain, we've not captured the author's name, but I can simply add that in here. Everything else is editable, with the exception of date access. I will simply save to sources. And from that point forward, this source will have this quotation mark grayed in. And so that means at a visual glance that the student has done the citation collection and corroborated all the citation information. Thenceforth, anytime that she goes on to this site and use this source, collects a note card, that source information will travel with the note card. I'm going to not go into too expensive detail, but this works also on PDFs. And one thing that I want to point out is that this feature here, the citation collection, is undergoing a major overhaul. In the very near future, perhaps 2 weeks from now, we will be able to collect all of the citation information without linking back out to the source. It's just going to be collected in the background, and the student will be able to choose the citation documentation style that she wants, so that she will be able to capture all that information. Currently on PDFs, for instance, if I were looking at a source here, I can highlight and use everything I want to here. I can create a new topic, for instance, in this. But when I go to collect the source information, there is no metadata to be collected. So I have to go back to the source. In this case, I'm going to JSTOR and collect the citation information that they've offered. We are going to be bypassing this stage. So I'm showing it to you now. That's the way it exists if you look at it now, but in the very near future, you will be able to come back to this and then create a citation automatically. So we'll not have this phase. You still will be responsible for making any corrections to the sources. But anyway, that's how that works. I want to point out quickly without demoing, there's a couple of other things that are going on here in the sidebar. You can do one of several new things. If this was a source that I was looking at, but I don't have time to read now, I simply can click. I can click the bookmark feature here. So this adds this source as a bookmark, a specific intentional bookmark here. One of the other practices that we know from students doing a lot of work online is they'll open up a dozen tabs, just like I have across my top row, and they'll also use the bookmark feature here to collect sources they want to go back to. But that also gets conflated with everything else they're doing. So it's very possible that the source information she's looking for here is going to be lost. So we create this opportunity for students just to collect a intentional bookmark. This little tab here also allows the students to take a capture of a screenshot. There are two ways that screenshots can be done. I can do a right click and capture this image, or I can do this screen clipping thing and come back in here and just capture something that I might want to save only a portion of that photograph for later. I'm just going to do this very quickly. Same thing happens. You have an opportunity to take notes on the source. I feel like I'm rushed, but I do want to make sure that we get out of here in just a few moments. The last thing that will happen here on this part of PowerNotes currently has two parts. This is the browser extension part. I can add blank note cards, which would allow me to do some of the work of my own. I might bring in information from primary sources. Maybe I've got field notes from some ethnographic work, or maybe I just want to write something in here that I think will serve my purpose as a transitional paragraph or a sentence that introduces a new source, etc. So there is this blank note card that has unlimited use for what students might need. Okay, now the second part of PowerNotes, let me jump to it very quickly, is the project outline phase. And I'm going to hit this toggle and you can see exactly what happens here. I can show you a deeper example of this in just a few moments with another project that I've been working on. But in this case, I can show you one or two or three real quick things. First thing that happens is this is the place in PowerNotes where a lot of organization and reorganization can be done. These note cards can be, think of them as a physical note card. I can move them around. I can drag and drop and move stuff to a different place in my organization. That's better suited for my next phase, perhaps writing first draft. If this were a very expansive project, it might not be possible for me to drag and drop on a screen without a lot of labor. So there's another option. I can hit this toggle, and then I can move this topic elsewhere into my project. It makes it easier to do. And I can also hit this toggle, and I can move this. Perhaps this is of use to this project, but it's also useful to something else I'm working on. So I can copy this note card and send it over to another project that I'm working on. And even within the organization of the other project, I can do that. The same functionality is available to us here at the unit level, at the theme level, at the topic level. By hitting that toggle, I've got the same options. I can delete entirely. I can move elsewhere in this project, and I can move a copy to another project, and I can move it elsewhere in this project. I'll show you a couple of buttons here just to let you know what's going on. This is a button that allows me to share my project. And by sharing my project, I'll show you an example of that. I've invited the opportunity to show my project with a teacher or peers. Perhaps there's a collaboration going on here. So this is a big project I've been working on. A lot of things are going on here, and I've shared back and forth. In real time, the student will be able to ask a question of or make a comment from this project to the person to whom he shared. Now, the option for a student when he hits this button is to allow the invitee to come in as a full editor, which means that person has full editing rights, composing rights, reorganization rights. It's as if she were a collaborator in the project. Or she can be invited to come in as a commentator. That might be the place where just peer work gets done. That's a very robust and expansive, and it operates in real time. So if I hit this button here and typed over the project ad, this will shoot over to the person to whom I've invited to join the project. And I can take a look, take a look at the comment and respond back to it. I'm not going to dive into that, mostly for sake of time here, because I want to wrap up in just a moment. So a couple other things that go on here. The other opportunity here is there are exports. So this student can generate all of this project in a Word document, which will show absolutely everything that's been collected in the organization in which it's been collected. Or I can export this as an Excel spreadsheet. An Excel spreadsheet offers me the opportunity to look at this stuff in sort of a two-dimensional way. I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. The default organization of our Excel offerings is by topic and by organization. And this is an example of what it would look like if I were taking this project and exporting it out as an Excel spreadsheet. It's a different project. In this case, this project is guided by topic outlines. It's a source evaluation project. And in this case, the teacher has asked the students to evaluate different sources using these evaluated criteria that you can see across the first row. If this were a topic organization, the first row would have the topic headings that I just generated as in a brief little demo. And down the left column, you'll see all of the sources that the student has been working with. In each cell, the student then will be able to see what she has highlighted and the comments that she's made. Now, this export and format affords the opportunity to do a couple of things at a quick glance. This came to us from the University of Pennsylvania Critical Writing Program, where they use this Excel spreadsheet to help teach the Lit Review, which is integral to their first-year writing course, but it's also an important part of upper division writing courses. Students learn to do an annotated bib and Lit Review very early in their process. Anyway, over in the right column, the student adds this analysis column. And then she's tasked with looking across this row and analyzing, according to these criteria, this particular essay that she's using as one of her source materials. Likewise, at the bottom row, you can add this column row called synthesis, in which the student then can go into these cells, go up and down the sources, and compare and contrast these source materials or analyze these source materials according to the criteria that's in the column. That is a quick blitz for what that Excel spreadsheet looks like. The other options in this Excel format are these absolutely the same information, just X and Y axis reversed. And also a couple of these export options are specific to law schools. So they're not so much of interest to this, to first year writing or writing across the curriculum. Now, one more thing I want to show you very quickly. This little button here that's been activated is a new feature. It's a button that actually will tell me time on task. We have new time on task features that are launched, and the student who activates that button, in a general sense, what happens here is the enabling assessment. There are several things that have to take place first. We will not do this by default. This is only by invitation and request of a writing program. So if the writing program said to us, please activate the time on task tools, then this button would appear on the student's project. It would not appear on a project if an instructor or the program is not asked for that. And then for a student to engage in this project and provide the assessment elements, she has to agree to it, and she has to understand that it will happen only for this one project. So there is nothing here that goes looking at work that she's done when she uses PowerNotes outside this specific project. When that happens, what happens is we capture actually the activity that a student is doing online. And this is what this kind of report would look like at this point. We will be refining this dashboard. But for the most part, you can see that this student, who's Kyle, a colleague of mine, has done all of this work inside PowerNotes, and you can begin to delineate, to distinguish rather, the different places where Kyle has done his work. In this case, links back here, you can see that it was a page activity on the web page itself. If you click over this here, it'll break down specifically what was done on that page. We will collect the time and stamp it and have it according to student activity. This will also be available to students. Everything that goes on here is going to be first in her dashboard and also in the instructor's dashboard. This is an opportunity for students to begin to reflect on themselves as readers and writers. Where do they spend their time? What are they active in? Perhaps where are they overspending time? I know I'm blitzing through that very quickly, but I want to make sure to get all of those points out there. We are currently working at some new features that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. When Janae asked me, there is the opportunity to okay, Mike, thank you. We should wrap up. Anyway, I will end up this right now. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take the questions, but please just use the contact information I offered you and get back to me if you'd like to have a further conversation. And thank you so much, everybody, for your attention. Thank you, everyone. Have a great conference. This looks like a fantastic agenda. And now that we've worked through some hiccups, Hoover is a dynamite place to gather. So this is going to be a lot of fun.